We're picking back up this morning with a sermon series that we've been walking through this fall, and we're going to keep plowing through this until we finish 2 Corinthians. The theme has been Untying the Knots, and it comes from the major theme of 2 Corinthians, Paul's most personal letter to one of his local churches that he planted, the Corinthians. And it's this simple idea that there are a lot of knots in which relationships cannot thrive with, right? Within interpersonal relationships, even among believers, there are things we call knots that just cause everything to hold up, cause everything to not push through and work through, and there to not sense or have this very real sense of there's peace and unity between us. And so Paul is writing 2 Corinthians. It's titled 2 Corinthians, but actually, most likely, this is his fourth letter to this local church. And it is implying to us that he loves them, and knots are to be untied. It is worth taking the time to untie knots in relationships. It's worth it. It's worth it. In fact, I would say that God calls us to be good stewards of the relationships we have by taking the time to untie the knot. So Paul's doing that, and we're entering back into the scene. We covered the first 7 chapters, and then if you think about this kind of the layout of this long, lengthy personal letter in 2 Corinthians, there's kind of this 2-chapter hiatus. There's a 2-chapter break. The first 7 chapters, Paul laid the foundation of the situation, and then he kind of made a convincing argument as to why he was really ministering in the gospel of grace. He's kind of saying, follow me in my ministry, don't follow those guys. And then we have chapters 8 and 9. And chapters 8 and 9 are different, very different in feel. And they have to do with the relationship that the Corinthians say they have, but in fact, it feels a little different. So Paul and the Corinthians have reconciled. The Corinthians, the majority of them, the Christians, have come back to Paul. But, I don't know if you know about this, sometimes you can sense when someone isn't all in with you, you know? Like they say they are, hey, oh yeah, we're good. But you just can't quite put your finger on it, right? And you're like, no. But we're not all good, are we? You know, like it isn't like complete. It isn't genuine. It isn't completely sincere. It's like you're giving me lip service here, and like it doesn't feel right. There's no other proofs. There's really no other proofs. It's just some lip service. Paul wants to make sure that this restored relationship between him and the Corinthians doesn't just turn into lip service. If it does, we call that what? Half-heartedness, right? Half-heartedness. Have you ever been in halfway with somebody? And you're like, yeah. And everyone can feel it, but you just don't really say it. That's honestly kind of the issue here. We deal with this theme of half-heartedness. But what Paul is going to allude to is that sometimes if we're half-hearted with each other as brothers and sisters in Christ, it's actually evidence that we might be half-hearted with God. It might be a connection to our relationship with God. And if I know something, I know this. It is hard to be a half-hearted Christian. I mean, it is hard to be a half-hearted Christian for a lot of reasons. I want you to think about what does it look like and feel like and is like to be a half-hearted Christian, where you're kind of half-heartedly giving yourself to the Lord. It's hard. You're constantly two-faced. You're constantly two-minded. You're one way in one situation and time, and then another way in another situation. It's really a hard kind of life. But it's a way of life that, ironically, a lot of us prefer. Unnecessarily hard. Paul wants to spare us from the hardship of half-heartedness. And this morning, instead of talking about all the ways in which you are half-hearted, this morning we're going to talk about a way to show that we're not. A very clear way to show that we're not half-hearted. And to dive in and say, I'm all in. I'm really all in with the Lord. So that's kind of the gist of 2 Corinthians 5 or 8, 2 Corinthians 8. And where we start is the first kind of 6 chapters we're going to look at, first 6 verses of chapter 8. Sorry about that. And you're going to see everything behind all these thoughts and lessons we're going to look at. It stems from just the idea of proving one's love. Proving one's love. And we don't like to think about that a lot, but this comes from a few verses. And this is 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. Just read this with me. Paul is saying, he says, I say this not as a command, but to prove, to test by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. This is the whole gist. Paul is seeking to prove. Paul wants the Corinthians to prove that their love is genuine. He's kind of testing them. He's giving them a test and seeing if they're going to pass, if they will in fact prove that their love is genuine. And the Lord conducts himself like this with us all the time. He gives us so many, if you will, tests in a good sense to show that we love him, to prove that we genuinely do love him. There are so many things in our life where God sets up, I believe, in the same fashion, where he's like, I just want you to have the opportunity to show that your love for me is genuine. The rest of the verse reads like this. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. That's why God would dare test something like this. He did it for us. And so he's wondering if we reciprocate the kind of love that he displayed to us. The big idea is generosity among believers often serves as proof. Proof that one has received the gracious gift of God's grace, and proof of one's genuine love to one another. Generosity serves as proof. It's interesting. The first 6 verses reads like this, and we're calling it under the big heading, the Macedonian motivation. Paul, it reads like this, 2 Corinthians 8, 1 through 6. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord. Verse 4, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. Accordingly, we urged Titus that as he had started, so he should complete among you this act of grace. Macedonian motivation. Summary, the grace of God among the poverty-stricken believers in Macedonia produced this kind of generosity where it exceeded expectations. And it moved Paul to urge the Corinthians to complete their act of grace, or we call it this collection. And just so we don't get all lost in maps and words that are familiar, Macedonia and Achaia makes up Greece, ancient Greece, right? Macedonia is the northern part of Greece, and then Achaia was the southern part of Greece, and that's where Corinth is. That's where Corinth is. So Paul's writing a letter to the Corinthian Christians, and he's referencing believers in the region of Macedonia. He's just traveled through that area and is traveling down to see them. And he's sending this letter ahead of him. And so he has experienced this kind of grace poured out on believers throughout Macedonia. And he's telling the Corinthians about it. So as I thought about how to preach through this passage, I struggled to know how to do it. Primarily because there's so much in here. And I know a couple things, and one specific that we had to nail down, and that is, if you look at verse 4, it says that the Macedonians were begging Paul for the favor, or actually it's the Greek word charis, or grace, for the grace of taking part in the relief of the saints. And according to verse 6, you can see Titus had started something, had went out and started something, and that something is what we call the collection. We'll just call it the collection. It's not a fancy word. It's not a fuzzy word. It's just something that was going on at the time. I'm going to tell you where it came from. Acts 11:19 reads like this. Now those who were scattered because of the persecution that arose over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch, speaking the word to no one except Jews. There was a great persecution that scattered believers everywhere, including Jerusalem, Judea. Acts 11:27-30 records this. Now in these days prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them named Agabus stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world. Verse 29, so the disciples determined, everyone according to his ability, to send relief to the brothers living in Judea. And they did so, sending it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. This is the beginning, if you will, of what became known as the collection. Paul went out on one of his missionary journeys, partly to share the gospel with the Gentiles, but also to collect funds from Gentile Christians so that he could bring them back to Jerusalem when he went there to help the Christians there who had been ravished in poverty due to persecution, or also due to, historically would say, there's a giant famine in that area. So there are Christians in Jerusalem that are struggling. They are poor. They are hungry. We'll just say this. They're in need. So Paul is one of the first missionaries. He's going and getting a collection. He references this collection in Galatians, only they asked us to remember the poor. Who's they? The elders from Jerusalem church. They asked Paul as he went on his way to remember them, the very thing he was eager to do. He's like, I'm going to go find help. I'm going to go find money so you can buy food, right? 1 Corinthians 16:1-3 references this too. He says, now concerning the collection for the saints in Jerusalem who are struggling or are in famine. He says, as I directed the churches in Galatia, okay, there we go, right above it, so you also are to do. And then he kind of describes what the collection felt like or how he conducted it. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I'll send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. So Paul's just like, it may be hard if I just randomly appear and then all the collection that you wanted to give will there. So just plan every week to set aside some money so that when I get there, oh, look it, it's already all here. And then I can take it with me, right? I mean, this is like money common sense 101. Save up a little bit at a time, and then when the time comes, you'll have a lot when it's needed. That was Paul's strategy for collection. This is cool stuff, isn't it? If it isn't cool stuff, then why are so many people struggling financially? Just follow some of these practical, back to the Bible basics of money. It's pretty good, right? Well, this is what's really cool. After that 1 Corinthians passage, some things happened, but we have this part. Romans was written later. It says this. At present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem. I'm concluding one of his missionary journeys. I'm going to Jerusalem bringing aid to the saints there who are struggling, right? He went out to help them. He's going back to them now. It says, for Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. Why do I bring that up? Hopefully you get a sense of what the collection was about, why Paul's asking for money. Oh, why is he asking for money? This is why. He's seeking to help the other Christians who are struggling. But the cool part is this. Whatever Paul says here in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, it works. It works. Why? Because Achaia also joined the Macedonians in contributing to the poor. Like, it worked. Paul's logic and his reasoning and his teaching, it worked. I wonder what he said about money that worked. What could he possibly say that would move your heart to be generous towards someone you don't know? These believers in Corinth, they did not know those believers in Jerusalem. They didn't know them from Adam or Eve or anybody. They didn't know them. And yet they still apparently gave generously to them. Wow, Paul must be a master manipulator. No. Listen to the logic and the reasoning and the pleading that he leans on that moves believers' hearts to give, to bring relief to other believers who are stricken in poverty. The first lesson we get is this: godly generosity is tied to God's grace. That's where Paul starts. I mean, verse 1, we want you to know, brothers, about what? About the grace of God that's been given among the churches in Mass. It's all about the grace of God. Grace is repeated, charis, the Greek word, in verse 1, verse 4, verse 6, verse 7, verse 9. It's an act of grace, gracious gift, favor to take part of, grace of Jesus Christ. There's a lot of kinds of generosity. But I fear a lot of kinds of generosity are just masks for different motivations, other than I've received grace from God, so I'm going to be gracious to others, especially when there's a need. I mean, it generally is that simple. But so much of, I'm going to provide some help and assistance, doesn't come from the godly motivation of his grace to us. It comes from some other means. Maybe if I help them, I'll get noticed, and I'll be noted as a generous person. There's so many different motivations that can come into being generous. So Paul anchors us to, if you have tasted the grace of God, an implication or an application is that you will become gracious, generous to others. It's so simple. But there is something that doesn't work within our very own hearts. Because if it was that simple, then I think we Christians would be known for being generous more than what we are. There's a breakdown here. I think other motivations are at play a lot of times. But Paul is anchoring us to the grace of God being our primary, main motivation. The Macedonians, their recipe or equation for generosity is wrong. It's wrong. This shouldn't have happened. Look at verse 2 with me. In a severe test of affliction, remember the Macedonians are struggling themselves. It says their abundance of joy plus, right, their extreme material poverty equaled this overflowing wealth of generosity. What? You have extreme material poverty plus abundant joy in God, and it results in what? Well, there's just not much material things there. They got a lot of joy, but there's not much material thing, so they can't have done much. Godly, gracious generosity. Stuff that Paul's like, you can't imagine, Corinthians, how much these people who had nothing gave. You can't imagine it. I don't know if you ever thought about what is the equation for you in order for you to become generous. A lot of times we think it has everything to do with how much material stuff we have. It doesn't. It doesn't. It has everything to do with, do you have joy in God? Has he satisfied you completely to where material things appropriately are appreciated by you, but really, he is your joy. so that no matter how much or how little you have, you can be crazy generous. It's all linked to being abundant in joy. Joy in God. Joy in God. Love, then, is the overflow of joy in God, which gladly meets the needs of others. That's love. That's love. It's the overflow of joy in God, which gladly meets the needs of others. Period. The Macedonians found great pleasure, joy in channeling the grace of God through their poverty to the poverty in Jerusalem. Those Jewish Christians in Judea and Jerusalem, when they got the gift from Paul and he recorded, oh yeah, these believers in Macedonia, they're worse off than you. But look at all they gave. What an example for those poverty-stricken Jewish Christians in Jerusalem to be like, no way. That's what it takes to be generous? To be completely filled with abundant joy in God? Wow. It kind of is convicting, isn't it? Do you find too much joy in the stuff you have, and as a result, you won't give it away to people who are in need? Do you not really find your complete joy in God, and as a result, you're not generous, but you're kind of Mr. Scrooge? At times, not all times, at times. It's convicting. I'm going to keep going here. Once again, these verses are packed and there's a ton of lessons, and I'm purposefully almost overwhelming us today with lessons. There's a ton of lessons. So there isn't like one or two or three. There's just a ton of lessons that are going to roll off my tongue. And my hope is that this is just all application. This is a sermon that's just all application, all like getting up close and personal, and you're going to be a little uncomfortable. But I hope and I pray, as it worked for the Christians in Corinth through Paul's methods, that it works for us. That it works. We just become generous. Another lesson is giving within your means is difficult enough, isn't it? Do we dare consider giving beyond our means? Now, Paul doesn't demand that we are to give beyond our means, but if you look here at the Macedonians, verse 3, they gave according to their means, as Paul's like, yeah, I get that, but beyond their means of their own accord. He's like, I did not tell them to do that. That's called generosity. It's called godly generosity. Someone can add up the numbers, and the bean counters can be like, oh yeah, I know why they can give that much, because this is how much they make, and this is how much they save, and this is how much. And then generosity just destroys the bean counters counting. And it's like, how did you give so much? You only have this much to give to start with in the first place. How did it grow into that? I don't know. That's why it's of God's grace. I don't know. I want my life to be like that. At times when God prompts me to give even beyond my means, and I think he's crazy, and just no, that's impractical. That's not good stewardship. I want to be a steward of God's economy, and I want to steward the way in which he stewards his funds, because he lavished so much to you and I. Shouldn't have done that. Wasted a lot on us, didn't he? He did not consider it a waste. He just had so much joy in pouring out that grace. We are to be like that. Number one, first challenge, and this is hard enough. Give within your means. As an expression of God's grace. Give within your means. That's hard. We could just period there and be like, man, I'm challenged by that. But then it's like it ups the ante here to say giving within one means. That's just like the baseline. Imagine being in a position attitudinally or even spiritually to where when you're called and asked and nudged by the Holy Spirit to give beyond your means, you do. And you taste the generosity of God when he poured out his grace in his Son, Jesus Christ, to us. Only an experience of God's grace would lead one to beg to participate, to give to a need. In our day and age, fundraising usually is someone begging you to give, right? Please, 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 right? And Paul went up to Macedonia, shared about the poverty of the believers in Jerusalem, and the grace of God poured out to where the Macedonians were like, Paul, please let us give. Paul's like, I can't imagine that response. These poor people are begging to give. And you can imagine Paul, hey, let's just keep that money to yourself. You don't have much as we, you know what I mean? Wouldn't that have been kind of Paul? To kind of be like, the Corinthians have more wealth than you, Macedonians, so keep it. You giving a little bit is great. You're poor, just keep it, right? Paul couldn't do that. He had the sense of like, I couldn't convince him of the logic. Instead, they were like, no, you have to take our money. You have to. Please let us take part in this. Please let us take part in bringing relief to the saints in Jerusalem who we don't know. But apparently there are brothers and sisters in Christ, and there's a spiritual connection between us. For the Gentiles, it's their spiritual heritage they're talking about. No wonder why they wanted to take part, right? Have you ever seen that? Have you ever thought about that? Taking part in giving to other believers. Should be something that you beg to do. Could be something that you beg to do. Please let me do that. I mean, when's the last time you were like, I just really want to give, and I don't want anybody standing in my way, and I'm going to get it done. Like, what a different way of life. I mean, what a different way of life. I can't explain that other than that is a person who have been struck by the graciousness of God and his son Jesus, and all of their joy is in him. And so they're kind of, you may call it careless or reckless, but we could also call it very generous in providing relief to believers that he doesn't know about, they don't know about. They beg to participate. Participating through generous giving to someone's relief is participation in God's grace. There's that connection here. I don't know if you caught it. Participating in giving to one's relief all of a sudden awakens you to where you are, in fact, being the practical grace of God to that person's life, and that continues to change you. Wouldn't it be great if we all had a dose of God's grace? How maybe could we get there? Well, give. Give to the relief of someone and be generous about it, and you'll find yourself caught up in what the Macedonians wanted to do in verse 4. They wanted the grace of taking part in the relief of the saints. They wanted to be part of a grace, an act of grace, a work of grace. Generosity includes sacrifice because it mimics God's grace to us in Jesus. Isn't one of the major hurdles of being generous or of giving is because it means sacrifice to other areas of your life? And if you ever feel that hiccup where you're like, well, that would cause me to sacrifice here, know that is exactly what giving is and what generosity is, because it mimics God's sacrifice in his son, Jesus Christ. So sacrifice shouldn't be like a hurdle to you. Sacrifice should be like, okay. Looks like I'm on the right track. This is the kind of godly giving and generosity that life is about. This is a story about the widow, and Jesus, sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich people put in large sums, and a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to him and said to them, truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box, for they are contributing out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. God didn't command her to do that. Jesus didn't command her to do that, but some way along the way, she defined that as generosity and she obeyed. And her generosity, in terms of amount, was smaller than everyone else's large amounts. But in terms of what God deemed acceptable and pleasable, it was more. It was greater. I think about Zacchaeus too. It says, and Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. What's powerful to me is that Zacchaeus doesn't say, behold, Lord, 1/10 of my goods, or 15% of my goods. He says half. sometimes we have standards that aren't of the Lord, that we haven't prayed about in regards to how much should we give percentage-wise. What does the Lord say? What is the Lord leading you to? It doesn't have to be 50, but there is a sense of you can ask, what does it look like for you to be generous? Zacchaeus, half, and then if he defrauded anyone, he was going to restore it fourfold. No telling what that amount was. No telling that Zacchaeus had stores of wealth ready to tackle that. He just knew that's right. It's right. It's about relieving those who maybe I've hurt. A generosity that exceeds expectations serves as a tangible experience of God's grace, and it inspires. I'll tell you a quick story along with this next lesson. That went fast, I know. Expectation. It sees expectation. It's a tangible experience of God's grace, and it inspires. If you're trying to write down all these lessons, good. Because you can meditate a whole year on all these. I did a week, and I feel like I've just cracked the surface of some of these things. A generosity of others can melt our hesitancy to be generous. Or can melt our hesitancy to ask of it from others. Paul is leaning on the Macedonians to melt the Corinthians' hesitancy of joining the collection. But if you look at this, verse 6, Paul says, accordingly, which means as a result. Paul is like, well, I saw the grace of God poured out on the Macedonians, and I wasn't going to do it, but now I'm going to invite you and plead with you to pick up the collection. Paul was hesitant to talk about this with the Corinthians. He didn't want to call out their maybe half-hearted tendency. No, he didn't want to do it. But the grace of God in the Macedonians moved him to be like, oh man, we need to live in grace. People need to experience, Corinthians, you need the opportunity to experience and participate in the grace of God. And so his hesitancy is gone. Then he launches into this most middle point of this most personal letter about money and giving. A couple weeks ago, the Tri-State Church Planting Cooperative, where there's about 7 churches that come together. We meet here about once a quarter, and we just pray about who God is raising up and what areas of the gospel is really not present very much around our regional areas. And we try to pair church leaders and pastors with places where they need a gospel-centered church. Or maybe there's a church that needs to be revitalized. So we meet for those ends, and there's 7 lead pastors. Well, last meeting there's 20 people there because we're overwhelmed by the work. But one example is really interesting. There's a new church that's a part of this church planting cooperative called Evermore Church in Hartville, Ohio. They just joined, and usually whatever you join, you give 1% of your budget to these ends, to planting churches. 1% of your budget. Every church there, 1% of your budget. And then if you're a sending church of a specific plant, you give another 1% to help fund that specific plant on top of your 1%. So usually, almost every church in the co-op gives about 2% of their budget to just see this happens and to see this happen. So Hartville or Evermore joined, and they just joined, and they're like, I know 1%, and we want to be a sending church, but we weren't here for about half of the year as part of like the co-op, so we're just going to give you another percent. Like, what? Like, you're the new guys, and you're showing us all up financially, like they're giving 3% of their budget. What? So later in the meeting, there was a church planter, one of the most recent church plants, Wave Community. They have some unique unforeseen needs come up financially, and they need about $3,000 more a month. And so it's on us. We have to decide, what are we going to do? And so out of our little fund, it was like, well, if Evermore can up the ante and give 3% and they're newbies, this work, they need some help, we're going to find a way, and we're going to grant them an extra $3,000 a month to get them through this hard time. And it was like this giant celebration, and we're all like, Evermore, this is your fault. You motivated us. You pushed us. You encouraged us. You melted our hesitancy to say, well, we need to kind of build a big stockpile. And there's some wisdom to that. But these expressions of generosity just move, and they inspire. And Paul is leaning on that. The second point, I know you're like, oh man, only second point. Yeah, second point, a lot of lessons. There's not as many lessons for this one, even though there probably is if you sit on there. Read verses 7 through 15 with me. So it continues. He looks at the Corinthians. Paul says, verse 7, he says, but as you excel in everything, in faith and speech and knowledge, in all earnestness, and in our love for you, see that you excel in this act of grace also. I say this not as a command, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. And in this matter I give my judgment. This benefits you, who a year ago started this collection, not only to do this work, but also you desire to do it. Verse 11, he says, now finish doing it as well, so that your readiness in desiring it may be matched by your completing it out of what you have. For if the readiness is there, it's acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what a person does not have. For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but that as a matter of fairness, your abundance at the present time should supply their need, so that their abundance may supply your need, that there may be fairness. As it's written, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. The affinity of finishing. There's an appeal by Paul to excel at acts of grace, to bring to completion what one desires regarding generosity. That's good. You got an inkling to be generous, follow through with it. And generosity, not a certain amount, is the aim. Not a certain amount, but generosity is. And it brings about a certain fairness among believers. The first lesson that I glean here when I look at these verses 7 and 8 is generous giving is something believers should excel in. Sometimes we just got to say that to ourselves. If we really are genuine believers, then we should be good at giving, because our God is really good at giving. Sometimes I just need to hear that. We need to excel in acts of grace. Paul's painful visit paused the Corinthians from collecting. How important are relationships? Remember, the Corinthians were starting to second guess Paul, so he went there. And when he went there, he was not received well, and it became very much contentious. And because of that fractured relationship, the Corinthians stopped collecting funds. Done. Sometimes we don't realize how important our relationships are to the very work of God, to seeing his purposes played out in our lives. Fractured relationships keep us at times from participating in the very purposes of God and providing relief to people who are in need. You ever thought about that? Connecting those dots? That's why Paul is writing, this is fourth letter, 2 Corinthians, to heal that heart completely. Half-heartedness, no. We need to be together, heart and soul, so that we can carry out God's gracious work among people who really need it. Paul's not saying I was right. He's just saying let's right this relationship and let's get on after God's purposes. You felt it in here, I hope, but I think it's so true of so many of us. The Corinthians had all this eager desire and enthusiasm at the beginning to start this collection and do a great job, and then some funkiness got in the way and they paused it and they stopped it and they never finished it. We are better starters than we are finishers, aren't we? Sometimes we chalk that up to, well, I'm visionary. Visionaries get things started and then everyone else takes care of it. No, let's just be honest sometimes with us. We're better starters than we are finishers. And this initial enthusiasm we have is never enough to finish. Finishing, though, is extremely beneficial. That's what the affinity of finishing is. When you finish a project, man, it feels so great. When you have a hunch to be generous towards someone or something, and you carry it out to completion, there's this sense of, yes, I'm carrying out God's command, his calling, his expectation. You gain affirmation from the Lord. It's beautiful. Another lesson. You prepare for your own time of need by how you give to others in their time of need. I don't know if you caught that, verse 13 and 14. Verse 14 especially. Paul was looking at the Corinthians saying, hey, you may be in need soon, so you better give. So that when you're in need, they give to you. It isn't completely like that, but he's just leaning on that logic and that reasoning of if you want those believers to generously give to you, then you need to be generous and give to those believers. I recently saw this lesson in life. My wife, a little while back, heard of a family in need. And this family had made their need known via social media and other avenues. And the point isn't that my wife responded and helped, but rather the point is the reality of what my wife experienced when she went there for a whole day. And she saw this. No one was there to help them. And at first impulse, your heart breaks. You're like, come on, people. Someone in need, we need to help them. And we do. No matter how the people are, no matter what happens. But the reality is these people hadn't prepared for their own time of need by being generous themselves beforehand. So it was really hard for people to be generous to them now in their time of need. Sometimes we genuinely think that we are completely safe and secure financially, that we believe the lie that we will work so hard and fortify our lives so well that we will never become in need. It's a Midwest American thing maybe, that it's a sin to be in need materially, monetarily. But as a result of that attitude in us, we don't empathize with others in need, and instead we judge them, which leads to us being stingy and not generous. Have you ever found yourself being like that? What happens, though, is many times due to unforeseen circumstances, we find ourselves in need. And a lot of times, as a result of our past lack of generosity, not only in need, but alone. Sometimes there's a hunch to where we are to live now so that one day when we're in need, people can find great joy in being generous to us because we had done so to them. Paul leans on that logic. I'm going to skip through these due to time. The last portion I want to read is verses 1 through 5 of chapter 9. It carries on the Macedonian leaning and some of the Titus stuff and just a few closing lessons here. Paul says, now it is superfluous for me to write to you about the ministry for the saints. He's like, you already know about it. He's kind of saying, I shouldn't have to write like this, but I'm letting you know. Verse 2. For I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the people of Macedonia, saying that Achaia has been ready since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. But I'm sending you the brothers so that our boasting about you may not prove empty in this matter, so that you may be ready, as I said you would be. Otherwise, if some Macedonians come with me and find that you're not ready, we'd be humiliated, to say nothing of you, for being so confident. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead of you and arrange in advance for the gift you've promised, so that it may be ready as a willing gift, not as an exaction or a begrudgingly gift. Paul had boasted at one time of the Corinthians' generosity to the Macedonians. Just like he's doing here to the Corinthians, he did it to the Macedonians. But now Paul is pleading for the Corinthians to live up to this boast. I know boasting isn't good, but here Paul references boasting a lot, especially in the latter chapters. And here, think about what Paul had done. Paul had boasted of how generous the Corinthians were towards this collection, how enthusiastic they were. And the Macedonians heard that from him. And that's what caused the Macedonians to get all excited about it. And now it's coming full circle. Paul's saying, hey, your generosity stirred up the Macedonians, and now it cooled off. So let their generosity stir you guys up once again, right? Many times, I'll say it like this. You have the potential to stir up generosity in others, but you also have the potential to be in need of being stirred up by others to be generous. Be quick to lean into powerful stories about generosity and be quick to take part in them. Today, we just referenced the handout. We gave 3 solid options as a church to participate in something together. It's not perfect. It's not exactly like the collection here, but what we're saying is next Sunday, Fish Food Pantry, we're going to collect and bring a bunch of stuff here because they distribute food to people in need in this area. And before we start to put disclaimers on, well, all those people could really get a job and stuff, no, we're done. We're going to jump in and take part in being generous to those who are in need in our local community. And we're going to do it again in December, a Fulton County Christmas cheer. This is just a tangible way to just take part in a generous way of life. Within the life of our church, I love talking about generosity. End of last spring, we had a capital debt of $1 million, and we were making off great progress, paying the funding off so that we can have a facility that really reaches out to the community we can use for the ministry to believers and the missions to unbelievers. It's great. But at the same time, we have a ministry goal balance monthly of about $72,000, and we were on track. We were in a great financial place. That's amazing. Most churches are struggling to be in that kind of situation. And then at the end of spring, right in the midst of those things are going on, we find out that our youth facility is really going to need, and our leaders determine that we want to build a facility here, on site here for our youth facility. But it's going to cost us above and beyond our ministry goal balance and capital fund. It's going to cost us upwards to $200,000. It's paid off. What? And then in the same breath as that's all going on, we found out that our neighborhood church up in Adrian wanted to renovate their facility that we planted in 1969, Church of the Good Shepherd. They want to renovate and use it for a community center to reach out to the poor in their local neighborhoods. And our church donated materials upwards to the cost of $20,000. I'm like, how does that happen? That's generosity that I want to get caught up in, and I'm so excited about. And I think there's going to be more and more opportunities for that going forward as a church family. And I just want to invite you to don't shy away from that, to participate in that. There's no commands, there's no expectations, but there is this thought. What does it look like for you to be generous? Ask God that question. What does it look like? What does it practically mean? What do you need to do in order to plan in order to be generous like that? That's the question. That's the goal. Generosity. Have you factored it? Have you prayed about it? Have you followed through and obeyed? Let's consider. Let's pray.